In the autumn of 1935, when the state of Ohio finally broke the locks on the Havenwood Sanatorium for restorative quietude, they weren't looking for bodies. They were looking for answers. They found something far more meticulous and, in its own way, far more terrifying. In a sealed sub-basement, behind a false wall in the administrative wing, they found the archives, not of medicine, but of annihilation. They found a ledger, and in that ledger, 73 names. 73 souls who, over the course of 28 years, had checked into Havenwood for treatment, and had simply ceased to exist on paper, in memory, and in the world. Their assets, their properties, their very identities, absorbed by the institution that promised to save them. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. Our story begins not in 1935 with the discovery, but in 1907. America was a nation straining at its seams, caught between the gilded opulence of the industrial age and the anxious dawn of the modern era. Fortunes were forged in steel and rail, but so too were shattered nerves. For the wealthy elite of the Ohio River Valley, mental fragility was not a medical condition. It was a stain, a shameful, inconvenient secret to be managed, hidden away from polite society. Public asylums were brutal, overcrowded warehouses for the destitute. But for the family with a name to protect, a melancholic wife, a son with unconventional passions, a daughter prone to hysteria, a new, far more discreet option was emerging: the private sanatorium, a place of gentle hills, quiet gardens, and, most importantly, high walls. And in Havenwood, Ohio, the most respected, most exclusive of these institutions was born: the Havenwood Sanatorium for Restorative Quietude. It was the creation of one man, Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was not a monster in the traditional sense. He didn't rave or brandish a scalpel. He was a man of science, or so he claimed. Erudite, compassionate, with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very soul of the person before him. He spoke in measured, hypnotic tones of neurological miasmas and psychic fractures. To desperate families, he was a savior. He promised a revolutionary cure, one he called the method of restorative quietude. It was a complete departure from the ice baths and electroshock therapies of the day. His method, he explained, required absolute tranquility. The patient's mind, he argued, was a fractured mirror. To heal it, all external reflections, all contact with the life that had broken them, had to be eliminated. If Dr. Finch was the mind of Havenwood, Matron Beatrice Thornton was its spine, a woman carved from ice and duty. Where Finch was warm and persuasive, Thornton was cold and efficient. She was the enforcer of the method. Her footsteps were silent on the polished floors, her gaze unwavering. She managed the staff, the schedules, the medication, and the isolation. It was Matron Thornton who would gently explain to new arrivals that, for their own good, their connection to the past had to be severed. No letters, no visits, no contact with the outside world. This, she would insist, was the only path to recovery: total, unconditional surrender to the method. The final piece of this triumvirate of decay operated not within Havenwood's walls, but in the mahogany-paneled law offices of the city. Julian Croft, Esquire, a man who saw legal documents not as instruments of justice, but as weapons of acquisition. The deception was a masterpiece of social engineering executed in 3 acts. The admission. A wealthy family, desperate to solve a problem, brings their loved one to Dr. Finch. He performs his diagnosis, validating their worst fears with a veneer of scientific authority. He guarantees a cure, but only if they commit to his method. The price is steep, but for peace of mind and the protection of a family name, no price is too high. The isolation. The patient enters Havenwood. Matron Thornton takes over. All personal effects are catalogued and stored. All lines of communication are cut. The patient is now utterly alone, their reality defined and controlled by Finch and Thornton. They are told their family has agreed to this, that it is a necessary part of their healing. The acquisition. Weeks later, Julian Croft makes a discreet visit to the family. He explains that for the long-term care and management of the patient's estate, to protect it from their own instability, it's prudent to transfer legal control, power of attorney, guardianship. He presents meticulously drafted papers. It all seems so logical, so responsible. The family, trusting the esteemed Dr. Finch, signs everything. The patient, locked away in quietude, never knows their fortune is being liquidated. The family, assured their loved one is healing in peace, never asks the difficult questions. And the trio of Finch, Thornton, and Croft grow wealthier with every soul that vanishes into the Havenwood fog. For years, the system was perfect. An elegant, silent machine for turning human beings into profit margins. They weren't just running a sanatorium. They were curating a collection of stolen lives, each one logged, stripped, and filed away in their secret basement archive. But they made one critical mistake. They believed their system was infallible. They never counted on the relentless curiosity of a single, determined woman who refused to believe that her sister had simply disappeared. The web of lies that was the Havenwood Sanatorium was about to be pulled by its first fragile thread. For nearly 2 decades, the framework of horror built by Finch, Thornton, and Croft was flawless. It was a silent, profitable harvest of the vulnerable. The wealthy families, convinced they were acting in their loved one's best interest, paid the exorbitant fees and signed Croft's papers. They were purchasing peace of mind, buying absolution from the burden of a difficult relative. They had no idea they were funding a factory of non-persons, an abattoir of the soul. Inside Havenwood's walls, the method of restorative quietude was not a cure. It was a process, a systematic, 3-stage psychological vivisection designed to dismantle a human being piece by piece. Stage 1 was subjugation. Upon arrival, patients like Eleanor Vance were stripped of their belongings. Matron Thornton would supervise this personally, her sharp eyes cataloging every locket, every photograph, every embroidered handkerchief. These weren't just personal effects, they were anchors to an identity, and they were all locked away in the sub-basement archive, becoming the first trophies of a stolen life. The patient was then confined to a quiet room. White walls, white linens, white uniform. The food was bland, the water was tepid, the staff moved like ghosts, speaking only in hushed clinical monotones. It was an environment of total sensory deprivation, engineered to make the mind desperate for any stimulation, any guidance. It was designed to break them. Stage 2 was inversion. Once the patient was disoriented and malleable, Dr. Finch would begin his sessions. He would sit with them for hours, his voice a gentle poison. Using the intimate details gleaned from their families, he would masterfully twist their own memories against them. "You remember a happy childhood, Eleanor," he might say, a soft smile on his lips. "That is a common delusion, a fantasy your fractured mind created to escape the truth of your trauma. The records, your family, they tell a different story." He would reframe their accomplishments as manic episodes, their joys as symptoms of delusion. Their very sense of self was methodically pathologized, turned into evidence of their own sickness. In his own journals discovered years later, Finch didn't write of healing. He wrote of deconstruction and wiping the slate clean. He saw himself as a pioneer, an artist erasing a flawed painting to create a blank canvas. Stage 3 was erasure, the final step. The patient, broken and confused, would begin to accept Dr. Finch's narrative. Their old name was used less and less, replaced by a number or a simple first name. Their complex past was replaced by a simple, predictable routine dictated by Matron Thornton. Wake, eat, medicate, walk the gardens, sleep, repeat. They were becoming docile shells, their inner worlds hollowed out, their assets now legally and irrevocably in the hands of the triumvirate. The system was perfect, until it came up against Martha Collins. Martha was Eleanor Vance's younger sister, where Eleanor was artistic and sensitive, the very traits that caused her family to panic after a severe bout of depression. Martha was pragmatic and resolute. She was a bookkeeper by trade, a woman who believed in numbers, in evidence, in things that added up. And the situation at Havenwood was not adding up. She had agreed to her sister's rest cure, with deep reservations, persuaded only by her desperate parents and Dr. Finch's silver tongue. But when her weekly letters to Eleanor went unanswered for 3 straight months, she began her polite assault. Her calls were always intercepted by Matron Thornton. The excuses were smooth, practiced, and infuriatingly calm. "I'm sorry, Miss Collins, but Eleanor is in a deep phase of her restorative therapy. Dr. Finch has forbidden any external stimuli. It is for her own good. To re-engage now would undo months of progress. Your concern is noted, of course, but you must trust the doctor's method." Finally, after 6 months of silence, Martha drove the 100 miles to Havenwood, unannounced. She was met at the imposing iron gate by Matron Thornton herself. The woman's smile never reached her cold gray eyes. No, she could not see her sister. No, she could not pass a note to her. No, an appointment could not be made. It was simply impossible. The method was absolute. As Martha was turned away, her mind racing, she felt a profound and chilling certainty. This wasn't a hospital. It was a prison with manicured lawns. Her sister hadn't been delivered to a place of healing. She had been fed to a machine. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of Havenwood, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. Standing outside those gates, defeated but not broken, Martha Collins made a decision. If they wouldn't let her through the front door, she would find a way to tear down the walls from the outside. She was a bookkeeper, a woman of ledgers and receipts, and she knew that an operation of this size, this sophistication, must have a paper trail. She drove away from Havenwood not with tears in her eyes, but with a cold fire in her heart. Her new investigation would not be about medicine or therapy. It would be about the one thing Finch, Thornton, and Croft truly worshipped: money. She began by looking into her sister's estate, and it was there, in the dry, dusty records of the county probate court, that she found the first recurring signature on a dozen different suspect documents, a signature that belonged to a man she had never met, the architect of their legal ruin, Julian Croft, Esquire. The third pillar of the framework of horror was about to be exposed to the light. Some monsters hunt with fangs and claws. Others, the most patient and terrible, hunt with paper and ink. Julian Croft, Esquire, was a master of this bloodless predation. He did not stalk the living. He stalked their legal existence. His hunting ground was the quiet, wood-paneled solemnity of the probate court, a place he had transformed into a solemn stage for a quiet execution. His masterpiece of evil was a document, a petition for guardianship. It was more than a legal filing. It was a eulogy for a person who was still breathing. It was an incantation that declared a soul null and void. With Dr. Finch's chillingly eloquent medical decrees of profound psychic fragmentation as his ammunition, Croft didn't just take control of an estate. He legally unmade a person. He rendered them a ghost in their own life, their voice silenced, their will erased, their wealth flowing like blood into the dark vessel he had created, the Quietude Trust. This is the world Martha Collins descended into, not for days, but for months that bled into a year. She was no longer just a bookkeeper. She was an archaeologist digging through a graveyard of paper, and she could feel the ghosts rising from the ink. Each document she uncovered was a headstone. Eleanor Vance, guardianship granted. James Atherton, assets liquidated. Clara Bellwether, property transferred. The same three names appeared again and again, a trinity of ruin: Finch, the prophet of lies; Thornton, the enforcer of silence; and Croft, the architect of the theft. Her investigation became an obsession that consumed her. She ate little. She barely slept. She began to feel a creeping paranoia, the sense that she herself was being watched, that the same predatory institution that had swallowed her sister whole was now aware of her, a gnat buzzing at the edge of its web. She knew that an organization that could make 73 people vanish without a whisper would not hesitate to silence one more. She needed to find a crack in the wall of Havenwood, a human voice. But the institution was a fortress of fear. Former employees she tracked down would pale at the mention of the sanatorium, their doors closing quickly, their voices dropping to fearful whispers of Matron Thornton's omniscience. They spoke of her as if she weren't a woman, but a spirit that haunted the halls, a creature of absolute control. Then, after months of dead ends, she found him, Thomas Riley, not in a diner, but in a squalid boarding house room that smelled of cheap whiskey and despair. Riley was a man who had not just left Havenwood, he had escaped it, and it had broken him. He was at a loose end, and he knew it. When Martha spoke her sister's name, Eleanor Vance, he didn't just look sad, he looked terrified. "You shouldn't be asking about that place," he rasped, his eyes darting towards the door. "They don't forget. They file everything away." Martha didn't push. She sat in the stifling silence of his room, simply bearing witness to his terror. And slowly, haltingly, the story came pouring out, not as a clean narrative, but as fractured, nightmarish images. He spoke of the medications, not just sedatives for sleep, but what Dr. Finch called his untethering agents, colorless, odorless liquids administered by Matron Thornton herself. Their purpose, as Riley understood it, was to chemically induce a state of confusion, to dissolve the bonds between memory and emotion, making the patient more receptive to Finch's psychological reprogramming. He told her of the silence wing. He confirmed its existence, but his description was far more chilling than a simple isolation ward. It was, he said, the sanatorium's final cure, the place where resistance to the method was treated as the ultimate pathology. He spoke of the cold, a deep, unnatural chill that clung to the corridor, a cold that the building's heating system could never touch. He spoke of the sounds, and the lack of them. "You'd hear someone fighting it for days," he whispered, his voice cracking, yelling, crying. "Then they'd be taken up there. And after that, nothing, just silence. The kind that's louder than a scream." His most harrowing confession was about the sub-basement archive. He had been forced to carry a new set of shelves down there one night, under Thornton's watchful eye. The false wall opened with a mechanism hidden behind a loose brick, and for 30 seconds his eyes adjusted to the gloom. It wasn't just files and ledgers, it was a mausoleum of memory. He saw a child's worn teddy bear with one button eye, tagged Patient 23, a tarnished silver locket, Patient 41, a Purple Heart medal from the Great War, Patient 56. It was a library of things that made people who they were, a collection of stolen souls. This was the final stage of the erasure. Once the mind was hollowed and the wealth was taken, they kept a single pathetic trophy from the life they had destroyed. Then his voice dropped to a choked whisper. He told Martha he saw his sister, Eleanor, Patient 47. He saw her being led by Matron Thornton towards the silence wing. He said Eleanor wasn't crying or screaming. She was calm. Her eyes met him for a single fleeting second, and in them he saw not fear, but a terrifying, defiant clarity. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what was happening and refused to be broken, even at the end. He never saw her again, but a week later he was ordered to carry a small, sealed crate to the archive. On it was a simple tag. It read, 47, Sketchbooks. This was it. This was the testimony that humanized the ledgers and gave voice to the ghosts. It was the key. Martha Collins gathered her meticulous research, her charts of financial ruin, and the soul-shattering testimony of Thomas Riley. She now understood the full, monstrous scope of the framework of horror. They didn't just steal from their patients, they curated them, deconstructed them, and then stored the last remnants of their identity in a hidden tomb. Armed with this terrible truth, she walked into the Ohio State Attorney General's office, not just as a grieving sister, but as an avenging angel for 73 silenced souls. The raid on Havenwood was no longer a possibility, it was an absolute necessity. Justice, when it finally comes for monsters, often arrives in the quietest hours before dawn. It came for Havenwood not with sirens and flashing lights, but with the subtle crunch of tires on a gravel drive and the soft click of car doors. A convoy of 3 unmarked state vehicles, carrying a dozen plain-clothed investigators and a grim-faced attorney general, slipped through the Ohio mist like wraiths. They had a warrant, and they had a map, hand-drawn by Martha Collins from the shattered memories of Thomas Riley. They were not there to ask questions. They were there to open the tomb. The plan was simple. Secure the 3 architects of the horror simultaneously. 2 investigators were dispatched to the opulent city home of Julian Croft, 2 more to matron Beatrice Thornton's Spartan cottage on the sanatorium grounds. The main contingent, led by the Attorney General himself, proceeded directly to the administrative wing, to the private residence of the good doctor. Dr. Alistair Finch answered the door himself. He was dressed in a silk robe, a book in one hand. His expression was not one of fear or surprise, but of mild academic curiosity, as if he were greeting a late-arriving colleague. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice as smooth and placid as a frozen lake, "to what do I owe this rather unorthodox early morning visit?" Even as the warrant was presented, as his world was crumbling around him, Finch maintained an aura of unnerving calm. He seemed to view the entire proceeding as a fascinating, if inconvenient, sociological event. He showed no remorse, no panic. It was the detached curiosity of a scientist observing the destruction of his own elaborate experiment. Matron Thornton's reaction was different. It was not calm, it was absolute stillness, a chilling, predatory silence. As they read her the warrant, her cold eyes darted from face to face, not with fear, but with a look of profound, venomous contempt. It was the fury of a queen whose sanctum had been breached by barbarians. She surrendered no emotion, only a silent, palpable hatred. While Finch and Thornton were being secured, the investigators descended into the heart of the machine. They bypassed the pristine patient rooms and the manicured gardens. They moved with purpose towards the west corridor of the administrative wing, towards a wall of seemingly innocent linen closets. Following Thomas Riley's directions, the lead investigator felt along the brickwork at the base of the wall. His fingers found it, a single loose brick. He pressed, the sub-basement. It was exactly as Riley had described, but the reality was infinitely more horrific. The investigator's flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing row upon row of metal shelves stretching back into the darkness. On those shelves were the spoils of 73 dismantled lives. They found the ledgers first, meticulous, cross-referenced volumes detailing the systemic absorption of wealth. Each patient was a chapter, beginning with their initial diagnosis and ending with a final accounting of their liquidated assets, down to the last penny. It was the business model of hell, laid bare in perfect, elegant calligraphy. But then they turned their lights to the boxes. Hundreds of them. Each one bore a simple numeric tag. The Attorney General, his face a mask of grim resolve, gave the order. "Open it." An investigator pried the lid off the crate labeled 47. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were not 1, but 3 leather-bound sketchbooks. He opened the first one. The early pages were filled with the vibrant, hopeful art of Eleanor Vance before Havenwood had stolen her light. But as the investigator flipped through, the images began to change. The birds became skeletal. The faces grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, the landscapes warped into nightmarish corridors and barred windows. Then, in the final sketchbook, the art stopped. The last dozen pages were filled not with drawings, but with writing, a frantic, desperate scrawl. It was a journal. Eleanor's final act of defiance, a testimony written from inside the silence wing, a message in a bottle from a soul drowning in the abyss.
They call this the method. It is not a method. It is a slow, patient murder of the self. Dr. Finch comes and tells me my memories are lies. Matron brings the medicine that makes the walls breathe. She says it is to make me quiet. It is to make me forget my own name. But I will not. My name is Eleanor Vance. My sister is Martha. I am an artist. I draw birds. I will not let them erase me. If you are reading this, it means they have failed. My name is Eleanor Vance.
They found it all. The war medal, the child's teddy bear, love letters, university diplomas, wedding rings. Each box is a silent scream. Each object is a testament to a life that was, a person who was deliberately and systematically unmade. The framework of horror was exposed. The evidence was undeniable. The quiet, respectable facade of the Havenwood Sanatorium for Restorative Quietude had been ripped away, revealing the charnel house of memory it had concealed for 28 years. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The raid on Havenwood did not end with the sunrise. It was merely the beginning. As news of the horrors discovered in the sub-basement leaked out, a wave of revulsion and disbelief washed over the state of Ohio. The very name, Havenwood, once a symbol of prestige and restorative care, became a curse, a byword for a unique and terrible form of evil. The trial of Dr. Alistair Finch, matron Beatrice Thornton, and Julian Croft Escurlo became a national sensation. It was not a trial about murder in the conventional sense. There were no bodies, no physical graves. The prosecution's case, led by the state attorney general and built on the foundation of Martha Collins's relentless investigation, argued for a crime that was, in many ways, more profound. 73 counts of conspiracy to commit identity erasure for financial gain. The perpetrators' reactions in court were as chilling as their crimes. Julian Croft, the legal architect, crumbled. Stripped of his mahogany-paneled office and his aura of invincibility, he was a petty, whining creature. He tried to blame Finch, to blame Thornton, to paint himself as a mere functionary, carrying out the instructions of his clients. His web of lies, so elegant on paper, fell apart under cross-examination. Dr. Alistair Finch remained a puzzle of detached pathology to the very end. He showed no remorse because, in his twisted world-view, he had done nothing wrong. He took the stand and lectured the jury, the judge, and the gallery as if they were his students. He spoke of his method with pride, describing his patients not as victims, but as flawed canvases that he, the master artist, had mercifully wiped clean. In his own words from the court transcript, "You speak of erasure as if it is a destructive act. I contend it is an act of supreme mercy. I did not destroy these people. I liberated them from the agony of a flawed existence. I gave them quietude. The financial arrangements were merely a necessary byproduct to fund this vital, pioneering work. He believed in his own poison. He was a monster who had convinced himself he was a god." And then there was matron Beatrice Thornton. She remained silent throughout the entire trial. She refused to testify. She sat like a statue carved from granite, her gaze fixed on a point in the far distance. She offered no defense, no explanation. Her silence was her final act of control, her ultimate expression of contempt for a world that dared to judge her. Observers in the courtroom said that to be the subject of her stare, even for a moment, was to feel a profound and unnerving chill. The jury's deliberation was short. The evidence from the sub-basement archive, the ledgers, the stolen mementos, and Eleanor Vance's heartbreaking final journal was irrefutable. All three were found guilty on all counts. Croft, for his cooperation, received a sentence of 20 years. Dr. Finch and Matron Thornton were sentenced to life in prison, destined to spend their remaining days in the very state institutions they had so arrogantly scorned. Finch died in the prison infirmary years later, still writing treatises on his method. Thornton outlived them all, dying in her 90s, having never spoken another word about Havenwood to anyone. But what of the victims? For most of the 73 souls, there was no happy reunion. The psychological damage inflicted by Finch's method was too deep, too permanent. Some were located in other, less scrupulous institutions where they had been dumped after their wealth was drained. They were shells of their former selves, with fragmented memories and a deep, instinctual fear of authority. They were lost souls, trapped forever in the fog of Havenwood. The families who had consigned them to that fate were left to grapple with a lifetime of guilt and shame. They had been duped, yes, but their desire to hide away an inconvenient relative had made them willing accomplices. The scandal shattered dynasties and ruined reputations across the Ohio River Valley, and Martha Collins, the bookkeeper who became an avenging angel, never saw her sister again. Eleanor's body was never found. It's believed she died in the silence wing, her cause of death likely a deliberate overdose or catastrophic neglect, her remains disposed of with the cold efficiency that defined the entire operation. All Martha had left was the small victory that her sister's final words were read, her name was cleared, and her story was told. The sketchbooks were entered as evidence, and they became Eleanor's lasting monument. The Havenwood Sanatorium was shut down, its assets seized. The building itself stood empty for decades, a monument to the horrors within. Locals whispered it was haunted, not by ghosts in white sheets, but by a profound sense of sorrow and loss that clung to the decaying walls. It was eventually torn down in the 1960s, a desperate attempt to erase a scar on the landscape, but some things can never be truly erased. The story of Havenwood is a terrifying reminder that the most monstrous prisons are not always made of iron bars, but of ideology, of twisted science and corrupted trust. It reveals how easily institutions designed to protect can become machines to exploit, especially when society sanctions the act of hiding its most vulnerable people away in the shadows. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that this kind of systematic abuse, hidden behind a veil of respectability, could still happen today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told. The promise made by the Blackwood Sanitarium and Anatomical Academy was a siren song to the desperate of post-Reconstruction Virginia. Free care, a warm bed, a chance at life offered by a family of esteemed physicians. We now know from the lead-lined chest unearthed in 1950 that this promise was a lie. The sanitarium was not a place of healing. It was a human abattoir, meticulously designed and operated by the Blackwood family for over 25 years. But this was not a descent into random, chaotic violence. The horror of the Blackwood enterprise was its evolution. What may have begun as a single, monstrous act of opportunity rapidly metastasized into a sophisticated, clinical, and terrifyingly efficient system of abduction, experimentation, and disposal. The Blackwoods didn't just commit crimes, they perfected them. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. At the head was the patriarch, Dr. Alistair Blackwood. His public face was one of stern, intellectual benevolence, but the coded journals reveal him as the operation's ideologue. He was the high priest of this dark church of science, convinced that the laws of man and God did not apply to his work. He saw the poor, the transient, and the forgotten not as patients, but as raw biological substrate. His justification, repeated over and over in his spidery, arrogant script, was the advancement of anatomical and neurological understanding. He was, in his own mind, a pioneer, and these human lives were the necessary price for progress. His wife, Ilara Blackwood, was the gatekeeper. She possessed none of her husband's medical knowledge, but she wielded a far more insidious weapon, a veneer of maternal warmth. It was Ilara who managed the sanitarium's public wards. She would identify the most vulnerable patients, those with no family to ask questions, no connections to the wider world. She would charm them with soft words and promises of special care, isolating them from other patients. Her primary tool was the Blackwood tincture, a custom compounded mixture of laudanum, belladonna, and a slow-acting paralytic agent. Administered daily in a cup of tea, it didn't kill, it was erased. It induced a state of profound lethargy, confusion, and suggestibility, making the victims pliant and easily moved to the sanitarium's private research wing, a section of the building that did not appear on any official floor plan. The operation's muscle and engineering fell to their son, Julian Blackwood. Trained as an architect, not a physician, Julian was a pragmatist. He viewed the growing number of subjects not with moral concern, but as a logistical problem to be solved. He was the one who designed and oversaw the construction of the sanitarium's high-efficiency furnace in the sub-basement. He convinced town officials it was a state-of-the-art heating system. In reality, it was an industrial crematorium, capable of reducing a human body to ash and bone fragments in under 2 hours. He developed a protocol involving quicklime and crushing mechanisms to ensure nothing identifiable remained. The ash was then mixed with animal manure and used to fertilize the sanitarium's unnaturally vibrant rose gardens, which Ilara proudly showed off to visitors. And finally, there was the family's quiet, unnerving daughter, Seraphina Blackwood. It was Seraphina who maintained the ledgers. She was the family's archivist of evil. With the cold precision of a botanist classifying specimens, she documented every victim. They were stripped of their names and assigned a number and a descriptor. Her journals, written in a complex alchemical and medical cipher, are the most chilling evidence of all. An entry from 1894 reads, Subject 114, the Irish laborer, presented with pulmonary distress. Alistair's protocol applied to test neural response to induced hypoxia. Expired 3:17 a.m. Julian processed post-mortem. Yield 7.2 talbs ash. Financial ledger updated to reflect cessation of resource expenditure. There was no emotion, no remorse, just data. Over 130 souls were reduced to entries like this. The Blackwoods had created a closed-loop system of horror. Ilara procured the victims. Alistair performed his ghastly experiments in a soundproofed chamber he called his anatomical theater. Seraphina recorded the results, and Julian erased the evidence. They rationalized their evil as a noble scientific pursuit. They were, in their minds, sacrificing the weak to create a medical framework that would one day save the strong, the wealthy, the important. They were weeding humanity's garden. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of Virginia's hidden horrors, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. This perfectly calibrated machine of death ran for nearly a quarter of a century. The Blackwoods grew wealthy, not from their legitimate patients, but by billing non-existent charities and foundations for the care of the people they were murdering. They were respected, they were untouchable. Their fortress of lies, built on a foundation of bone and ash, seemed utterly impenetrable. But no system is perfect. No secret can be kept forever. And in the fall of 1902, a single, unforeseen crack would appear in the Blackwood family's fortress. A crack created not by a detective or a crusading journalist, but by a lone, stubborn man looking for his missing brother. For 25 years, identities, the Blackwood Sanatorium operated with the flawless precision of a Swiss watch, its gears lubricated by the trust of the community and the blood of the forgotten. But every machine, no matter how perfectly designed, has a point of failure. For the Blackwoods, that failure arrived in October of 1902. It came not as a force of law, but in the form of one man, a man who made the fatal mistake of loving someone the Blackwoods had deemed worthless. His name was Thomas Kearney. He was not a detective, nor a man of means. He was a stonemason from Baltimore, with calloused hands and a quiet, unyielding stubbornness forged by years of shaping granite. His younger brother, Liam, had come to Virginia seeking work on the railroad, a gentle, hopeful soul who sent letters home every week, until, suddenly, he didn't. The last letter mentioned a terrible cough and the good fortune of finding free care at the esteemed Blackwood Sanatorium. After 6 weeks of silence, Thomas packed a small bag, told his foreman he'd be back in a week, and took the train south. Thomas's first stop was the office of the local lawman, Sheriff Brody. A portly man with a comfortable relationship with the town's benefactors, Brody listened to Thomas's story with a practiced air of weary patience. He glanced at the faded photograph of Liam, a young man with hopeful eyes. "Son," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair until it groaned, "men like your brother, drifters, you understand, they get the itch. He probably heard about work in Tennessee and just lit out. Happens all the time." Thomas's voice was low and steady. "He would have written, he promised our mother." Sheriff Brody sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Promises get forgotten when there's $1 to be made or a bottle to be had. The Blackwoods run a fine Christian place. If they say they discharged him, they discharged him. I'm not going to bother Dr. Blackwood over a runaway laborer." It was the first wall Thomas hit, a wall of polite, official indifference. He knew then he was alone. His next stop was the source. The Blackwood Sanatorium loomed at the edge of town, its pristine white paint and manicured lawns a stark contrast to the wild Virginia woods that surrounded it. He was met at the door not by a doctor, but by Alara Blackwood. She was the picture of grace and compassion. She listened to his story, her brow furrowed with concern. "Oh, the poor dear," she cooed, her voice like warm honey. "Kearney. Yes, I believe I remember him. A sweet boy, but so withdrawn. Let me check our records." She returned with a heavy leather-bound ledger. She ran a manicured finger down a page and stopped. "Ah, yes, here we are. Liam Kearney, admitted September 4th, treated for consumption, discharged and in much improved health on September 19th. See, we even have his signature here, releasing us of care." She turned the book. The signature was a crude, shaky version of Liam's name, a forgery and a poor one at that. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "He had no money," Thomas stated, his eyes locked on hers. "Where would he have gone?" "The Lord provides, Mr. Kearney," Alara said smoothly, closing the book. "Perhaps he found a ride with a traveling merchant. We did all we could. Would you care for some tea? You look exhausted from your journey." Thomas looked at the porcelain cup she offered, the dark liquid steaming within. He saw the placid kindness in her eyes and felt a primal sense of danger he had never known. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I'll find him myself." He didn't leave town. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Liam had never walked out of that building. He took a job at the town livery, mucking out stables, his eyes constantly fixed on the sanitarium on the hill, and he watched. He learned the rhythms of the place. He saw the grocer make deliveries. He saw the wealthy patients arrive in carriages, and he saw something else. On clear, mild nights when no furnace was needed for heat, he would see a thin plume of dark, greasy smoke rising from a tall, isolated chimney at the rear of the property. It would rise for an hour, maybe two, always after midnight. Then it would stop. His break came from the town's drunkard, a man named Silas Croft. Thomas found him shivering outside the saloon and bought him a meal. Between bites of bread and stew, he learned Silas had once worked at the sanitarium. He was the furnace stoker, until Julian Blackwood had fired him for being drunk and asking too many questions. "That ain't no normal furnace," Silas rasped, his eyes wide with fearful memory. "The things they'd bring down there, late at night. Julian and the doctor, always on a gurney, always covered with a sheet. Heavy, so heavy, and the smell when that fire got going." He shuddered, unable to continue. Thomas leaned in closer. "What questions did you ask, Silas?" "I asked Julian what in God's name could smell like that. Smelled like a butcher's shop and a barber's shop all at once, like burnt hair and pork." Silas's hand trembled as he reached into a ragged coat pocket. "He told me to mind my own business, fired me the next day. But before I left, when I was cleaning out the ash pit, I found this." He uncurled his gnarled fingers. Lying in his palm was a small, blackened piece of metal, warped by intense heat but still recognizable. It was a St. Christopher medal. Thomas stared at it, his blood turning to ice. His mother had given an identical one to Liam before he left Baltimore. He reached out and took the medal. It was still coated with a fine, grayish dust. The weight of it in his hand was the weight of the truth. It was small, it was damaged, but it was not ash. It was not bone. It was proof. It was the key, and with it, Thomas Kearney knew he was going to tear the house of Blackwood down to its very foundations. A piece of evidence is a dead thing. A bit of metal, a scrap of paper, a stain on a floorboard. It cannot speak. It cannot act. It requires a human hand to lift it from the darkness, and a human will to force the world to look. In the palm of his hand, Thomas Kearney held a blackened St. Christopher medal, coated in the fine gray ash of his brother. It was a dead thing, but in the cold, righteous fury of a brother's love, it was about to become a weapon. He didn't knock this time. Thomas Kearney walked straight into Sheriff Brody's office and placed the warped, heat-blasted metal on the man's desk. The metallic clink was the only sound in the room. "You asked for proof," Thomas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This was my brother's. An old furnace stoker found it in the ash pit of the sanitarium's incinerator." Sheriff Brody stared at the object. He could see the scorched effigy of the saint, the gray dust clinging to its edges. He picked it up. It felt heavier than it should. The story from the town drunk, Silas Croft, which Brody had dismissed as rambling, now echoed in his mind, especially two words. "He said," Brody began, his own voice now a low tremor. "He said it smelled like burnt hair and pork." "They're not heating the building with that furnace," Thomas said. "They're erasing people." At that moment, Sheriff Brody was no longer a complacent town official. He was a man staring into an abyss that had opened at his feet. The Blackwoods were not just pillars of the community. They were a part of the town's very identity. To move against them was to move against the town itself. But the medal on his desk and the dead-eyed certainty of the man before him left no room for doubt. The lie was too enormous to ignore. He stood up, his face pale. "Get your coat, son," he said grimly, "and get my deputies, all three of them. We're going to pay Dr. Blackwood a visit. And we're bringing axes." The raid on the Blackwood Sanatorium did not happen with sirens and shouting. It began just before dawn, a silent procession of 5 grim-faced men walking up the long, manicured drive. There was no warrant, only the terrible conviction of a brother and the dawning horror of a lawman who had failed his post. They entered through the unlocked kitchen. The public wings of the sanitarium were as clean and peaceful as ever. A few patients stirred in their beds, roused by the sound of heavy boots on polished floors. But the men were not interested in the public wards. Guided by Thomas, they made their way to the private research wing, a hallway ending in a solid, seamless-looking wall of oak paneling. There was no door. One of the deputies swung his axe. The sound of splintering wood shattered the sanctimonious quiet of the sanitarium. Behind the false paneling was a heavy, steel-lined door. It took 10 minutes of brutal work to break it open. The air that rushed out was cold and sterile, thick with the chemical tang of formaldehyde and something else, something coppery and old. This was Dr. Alistair Blackwood's anatomical theater. It was a nightmare of clinical precision. The walls were white tile, the floor slanted toward a central drain. In the center stood a porcelain and steel table fitted with thick leather restraints at the wrists, ankles, and neck. The straps were dark with old stains. On a long marble countertop against the far wall lay an arsenal of surgical tools that no sane physician would ever own. Polished bone saws, hand-cranked cranial drills, strange, hook-bladed knives, and rows of gleaming trocars and syringes. On a shelf, dozens of glass jars held preserved organs and tissue samples, each meticulously labeled not with a name, but with Serafina's chilling alphanumeric code. Sheriff Brody felt a deputy retch behind him. On the central table, beneath a blood-stiffened sheet, lay a human form. Brody lifted a corner of the sheet. It was a young woman, her body subjected to a horrifying and unfinished dissection. He dropped the sheet as if it were on fire. This wasn't a crime scene from the past. They had walked into the middle of the horror itself. While 2 deputies secured the lab, Brody and Thomas descended a steep iron staircase into the sub-basement. The air grew hot and thick with the smell of ash and soot. Here was the furnace, a monstrous brick and iron behemoth. Julian Blackwood stood before it, frantically shoveling the contents of a wheelbarrow into the roaring flames. He looked up, his face a mask of sweat and panic. In the wheelbarrow, deputies saw the clothes and personal effects of the woman from the table upstairs. He was destroying the last remnants of her identity. He was subdued quickly. As the deputies cuffed him, Thomas kicked at the large pile of ash and clinker near the furnace base. His boot struck something hard. He knelt down and sifted through the gray dust. He found a small, mother-of-pearl button, a steel shoe buckle, the tortoise-shell shard of a woman's comb, a tiny silver locket fused shut by the heat. These were the final, anonymous remnants of the more than 130 souls who had entered the sanitarium and never left. The final confrontation was the most chilling. Upstairs, in a small, tidy office, they found Serafina Blackwood. She sat at her desk, a fresh ledger open before her, an ink pen in her hand. The sounds of the raid, the shouting, the splintering wood, had not disturbed her. She looked up at the armed men with a look of mild annoyance, as if they had interrupted a complex calculation. On the page before her, she had just written the heading, Subject 138, Jane Doe, commenced preliminary preparation. They found Dr. Alistair Blackwood and his wife Ilara in their private quarters. There was no panic, no fear. When Sheriff Brody told them they were under arrest for murder, Alistair simply scoffed. "Murder?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sheriff, you are a fool. You cannot comprehend the work being done here. I am on the cusp of discoveries that would render disease a footnote of history. The material I use is inconsequential. It is the cost of progress." Ilara stood beside him, her mask of maternal warmth replaced by a face of cold, reptilian fury. She said nothing. She simply stared at Thomas Kearney with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, not for what she had done to his brother, but for his audacity in spoiling their great work. As the sun rose over Virginia, the town of Harmony Creek awoke to an impossible sight. The 4 members of the Blackwood family, the town's greatest benefactors, were led from their pristine sanitarium in chains. They were paraded down the very streets they had helped pave, past the faces of the people who had trusted them, revered them, and unknowingly fed them victims. The white walls of the sanitarium were now the walls of a tomb, and its beautiful rose gardens, fertilized with the ashes of the dead, seemed to mock the dawn with their vibrant, blood-red blossoms. The House of Horrors had finally, violently crashed down. But the story of its legacy and the ghosts it left behind was only just beginning. The trial of the Blackwood family was not a trial of guilt or innocence. Their guilt was etched into the tiled walls of the anatomical theater and buried in the ash pit of Julian's furnace. No, this was a trial of comprehension. The Commonwealth of Virginia, and indeed the nation, struggled to comprehend how such methodical, industrial-scale evil could flourish behind a facade of medicine and grace. The courtroom was a theater of the macabre. Dr. Alistair Blackwood served as his own counsel, not to prove his innocence, but to lecture the jury on his genius. He spoke of his victims as biological contributions, and of his crimes as unpleasant but necessary steps toward a new echelon of human understanding. He showed no remorse, only contempt for the inferior minds who sought to punish him for his vision. He was sentenced to death, a fate he met not on the gallows, but in his cell 2 weeks before his execution. He was found dead from a meticulously self-administered dose of poison, smuggled in by a still unknown sympathizer. His final act was a note left for the warden, which read simply, "You cannot execute progress." Julian Blackwood, the pragmatist, tried to bargain. He offered detailed schematics of the incinerator and a full confession of his methods for body disposal in exchange for a lesser sentence. The prosecution used his chilling, matter-of-fact testimony to illustrate the family's profound moral vacuum. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of a stroke 30 years later, a quiet, unremarkable end for a man who had engineered the erasure of so many. Ilara Blackwood remained silent throughout the trial. She sat with perfect posture, her gaze fixed on some distant point, a statue of pure, unrepentant hatred. Her silence was more damning than any confession. She too received a life sentence and lived for another 42 years in the state penitentiary, becoming a phantom of institutional memory. The old woman in cell block D, who never spoke a word, her hands forever looking as though they were about to offer a poisoned cup of tea. And then there was Serafina. Her case was the most disturbing. Her ledgers, once deciphered, became the prosecution's primary exhibit, Exhibit A. The sheer volume and dispassionate detail within them were considered proof of a mind both brilliant and monstrously broken. Declared criminally insane, she was committed to the Western State Asylum, where she spent the remainder of her life. She was given notebooks to occupy her time, and she filled them. For 50 years, she continued her life's work, documenting the other patients, their ailments, their habits, their eventual deaths, assigning each one a new, complex alphanumeric code. These asylum ledgers are now kept under lock and key at the state archives, a chilling testament to a pathology that could not be imprisoned. The impact on the community of Harmony Creek was catastrophic. The town's name became a bitter irony, synonymous with a deep communal shame. Trust was shattered. For a generation, no one looked at a doctor without a flicker of suspicion. No one accepted charity without a second thought. The sanitarium itself was razed to the ground a year after the trial, as if trying to tear the memory from the earth itself. But the land remained. No one would buy it. No one would build on it. The unnaturally vibrant rose gardens, once Ilara's pride, withered and died without their special fertilizer, leaving behind a barren patch of ground that locals still swear is cursed. For his part, Thomas Kearney became a reluctant hero. He didn't want fame. He only wanted his brother. The state, spurred by the national outcry, passed the Kearney Act of 1905, a landmark piece of legislation that mandated stringent state oversight of all private medical and charitable institutions, creating the first centralized registry for patient admissions and mortality. It was a law written in the ash of over 130 victims. Thomas attended the signing, then quietly returned to Baltimore with Liam's scorched St. Christopher medal in his pocket. He never spoke of the Blackwoods again. The full scope of the horror was intentionally buried. The trial records were sealed for decades under the guise of public decency, but truly out of a deep-seated desire to forget. The story of the Blackwood family faded from national news, into a whispered, local ghost story, a tale to frighten children. Its horrific, factual truths diluted by time. It wasn't until the 1950 demolition of an old town records building, a demolition which unearthed a sealed, lead-lined chest containing Serafina's original, coded journals that the town had hidden away, that the true systematic nature of the crimes began to resurface among historians. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that our trust in powerful institutions can still be used as a weapon against the vulnerable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told. Our investigation seems complete. The guilty were punished, the law was changed, and the ground where the sanitarium stood lies below. A neat, historical conclusion. But the Blackwood case does not offer such clean endings, because the true legacy of this horror isn't found in a prison record or a law book. It is found in a locked room in the Virginia State Archives, and it is still growing. I'm speaking, of course, of the asylum ledgers of Serafina Blackwood. After she was committed, Serafina's pathology did not cease. It simply found a new ecosystem. For 51 years, until her death in 1954, the state provided her with the only things she seemed to desire: a pen, a notebook, and a closed population of human subjects. And so she continued her work. These are not the ramblings of a mad woman. They are a terrifying extension of her original ledgers. The alchemical and medical ciphers are identical. Her methodology is unflinching. She applied the same cold observational lens to her fellow patients and her keepers at the Western State Asylum as she did to the victims in her family's abattoir. An entry from 1928 concerning another patient is typical. Subject A47, the hysteric, female, age approx. 45, exhibits cyclical auditory hallucinations, dosage of chloral hydrate administered by staff at 9:00 p.m. Result, 8 hours of dormancy, a predictable if inefficient method of behavioral suppression. Resource expenditure remains constant. She documented staff rotations, patient conflicts, every death by disease or old age. She noted who received extra food, who was subjected to hydrotherapy, who was forgotten in the shuffle of an underfunded, overburdened institution. To Serafina, the asylum was simply a less efficient version of the sanitarium, a place where the biological substrate was managed and allowed to expire slowly, rather than being put to productive use. She saw waste where her father had seen opportunity, but the most disturbing aspect of the asylum ledgers is how they illuminate the true horror of her original work. Her first ledger, the one from the sanitarium, contained 137 entries. Thanks to the tireless work of Thomas Kearney, we know Subject 114 was Liam Kearney. But who were the other 136? They were the Irish laborer, the itinerant preacher, the consumptive girl, the foundling. They were erased twice, first by Julian's furnace, their bodies turned to ash and smoke, and then again by Serafina's pen, their names and histories replaced by a cold, clinical descriptor and a number. Their families, if they had any, never knew. Their disappearances were just another loose thread in the ragged fabric of a transient America. They remain ghosts, not of a place, but of history itself, unclaimed, unmourned, and unidentified. But there is one final, lingering mystery. The very last entry in Serafina's final ledger, written on the day she died, is different. After 51 years of meticulous observation, her final page contains no notes on patients. It contains only a single, sprawling mathematical equation. Cryptographers and historians have studied it for decades. It is a terrifyingly complex formula, incorporating the number of victims from the sanitarium, the number of patients she documented at the asylum, their estimated lifespans, and dozens of other variables drawn from her life's work. The equation is unsolved. No one knows what it was meant to calculate. But the prevailing theory is as chilling as the woman who wrote it. After a lifetime of detached clinical observation, of documenting what she saw as a vast, inefficient system of human existence, some believe that in her final moments, Seraphina Blackwood was trying to balance the books, that she was attempting, with her terrible arithmetic, to create one final, grand, unifying theory for it all, to find a logical, mathematical answer to a life of absolute, unimaginable horror, to justify the ash, to give numerical value to the screams. The equation remains a testament to a mind that saw humanity not as a collection of souls, but as a problem to be solved. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying legacy of the Blackwood family. Not the evil they did, but the chilling, meticulous, and profoundly rational way they did it. And there, the official record ends. A family of monsters brought to justice. A cursed piece of land left to the weeds and the whispers. A set of coded ledgers that serve as a final sterile monument to the dead. For nearly a century, that was the full story. But the earth keeps its secrets loosely, and it does not care for official records. The year is 2011. The town, now a sprawling suburb of Richmond, has finally shed the name Harmony Creek, hoping to bury its history under a new identity. The Blackwood property, a blight on the tax rolls for over 100 years, is sold to a logistics corporation for development into a regional distribution hub. The local superstitions are dismissed as rural folklore by a board of directors in a distant city. During the ground-clearing phase, the operator of an excavator felt a jolt. His machine, designed to tear through earth and rock, had been stopped by something unyielding 6 feet beneath where the sanitarium's sub-basement once stood. It was not a foundation stone. It was a heavy iron strongbox, roughly 4 feet long, sealed shut by a century of rust and packed soil. A box Julian Blackwood had buried deep beneath his furnace before the concrete floor was ever poured. Forensic archivists from the state were called in. They worked for 3 days to open the box without destroying its contents. When the lid was finally pried open, the air was filled not with the smell of decay, but with the cold, damp scent of metal and earth. There were no bodies. There were no ledgers. Julian's furnace had been for the flesh and bone. This box, this was for the things the fire could not erase. Inside, nestled in what was once oilcloth, was the stubborn, metallic ghost of the Blackwood's victims, a heap of small, personal artifacts, the final, indestructible fragments of 137 forgotten lives. There was a pile of wedding rings, most of them simple gold bands, dozens of suspender buckles and steel shoe shanks, a child's tin soldier, its painted uniform flaked away, a silver locket fused shut, a tiny portrait of an unknown face forever trapped inside, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, one lens shattered, and, most chillingly, a collection of dental bridges and gold fillings pulled from the victims before their final journey to the furnace. This was not an archive of data, like Seraphina's journals. This was an archive of identity. It was the anti-ledger, a collection of stolen memories. The investigators realized with a dawning horror that this was Blackwood's final, pragmatic cruelty. These items, if found on an ash heap, could have been used for identification, a specific ring, a custom dental bridge. So Julian, ever the logistician, had buried them deep, ensuring his family's victims would remain forever anonymous. He was not just destroying bodies. He was meticulously destroying the last physical evidence that these people had ever been loved, had ever been individuals. Today, these artifacts sit in a climate-controlled room at the Virginia Museum of History, displayed in a small, quiet exhibit titled The Harmony Creek Collection. Each tarnished ring, each bent buckle, is a silent testament to a life. They are the final rebuttal to Dr. Alistair Blackwood's ideology, proof that there is no such thing as an inconsequential human life. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that our society, even today, sometimes values people based on their perceived contribution, forgetting the inherent value of a human soul? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told. Narrator: history is not static. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the dead. And sometimes the dead speak back in a language we are only just beginning to understand. We left our story in a museum with a box of metal trinkets, and in an archive with a madwoman's final unsolved equation. For most, this is where the trail goes cold. But the Blackwood case, and the peculiar genius of Serafina, has a way of ensnaring certain kinds of minds that see not just a historical crime, but a puzzle, a pattern. Enter Dr. Eris Thorne, a professor of computational linguistics and historical cryptography at Georgetown. Thorne was not a historian, he was a pattern seeker. For him, Serafina's ledgers were not just a record of evil, they were the product of a complex, internally consistent system, and her final equation was the ultimate challenge. He became obsessed. For 2 years, Thorne worked. He digitized every page of Serafina's ledgers, both from the sanitarium and the asylum. He fed them into a powerful neural network he designed himself, teaching it to recognize the patterns, the ciphers, the cold, inhuman logic of Serafina's mind. He called the project the Blackwood Cipher, treating it as a purely academic exercise. He was trying to map the contours of a dead woman's madness. He was not prepared for the madness to map him back. The final equation was the key. It resisted every conventional cryptographic attack. It was, as Thorne wrote in his notes, less a calculation and more a philosophical statement rendered in mathematics. But the neural network, saturated with Serafina's logic, found a new way in. It didn't try to solve the equation for a single answer. It interpreted it as something else entirely. It was an algorithm. Serafina Blackwood's final work was not a confession. It was not a summary. It was a predictive model. It was a tool. A terrifyingly elegant piece of code designed to do one thing: identify the socially invisible. The algorithm cross-referenced a chilling set of variables drawn from her life's work: transience of residence, lack of local family connections, non-participation in community groups like churches or unions, specific types of low-wage, temporary labor, and patterns of medical history indicating chronic but non-fatal conditions. It was a mathematical formula for finding the people who could be removed from society with the lowest possible probability of anyone noticing. It was the Blackwood family's entire hunting methodology, distilled into pure, cold logic. The architecture of erasure. In a final hubristic act of academic curiosity, Dr. Thorne decided to test it, using publicly available, anonymized census data from the city of Baltimore, the very city from which Thomas and Liam Kearney had come. He ran Serafina's century-old algorithm through his modern computer. He expected statistical noise, an anomaly, a historical curiosity. The program ran for 17 seconds. Then his printer whirred to life. It began to print a list of names, not from 1890 but from 2023. 412 individuals living in the city of Baltimore who, according to Serafina Blackwood's grim calculus, were statistically perfect victims. People who existed on the frayed edges of the modern world. The day laborer paid in cash. The elderly woman whose only family lives 3 states away. The transient youth moving between shelters. The gig worker with no fixed address. Dr. Thorne stared at the list, the paper spooling onto the floor. He had not resurrected a ghost. He had updated it. He had taken the evil of a single monstrous family and proven its timeless, scalable efficiency. The very systems of data and observation we have built for ourselves, he realized, are the most powerful tools a modern Blackwood could ever dream of. He immediately deleted his research, reformatted his hard drives, and burned his physical notes. But the question remains, hanging in the air like the greasy smoke from Julian's chimney. How many other systems, built by corporations or governments, are running their own versions of Serafina's algorithm right now? How often do we, as a society, use data not to see people, but to render them invisible? The Blackwood Sanatorium is gone. But the ideology that built it, the belief that some lives are merely substrate, that some people are simply data points to be managed or deleted, is more alive and more powerful than ever. It is the ghost in the machine. We began this story in the dirt and dust of post-Reconstruction Virginia, with a warped piece of metal found in a pile of ash. We followed it through courtrooms and asylums, through sealed records and a buried strongbox, and we ended it here, in the cold, clean logic of a server farm, with an algorithm born from a madwoman's mind a century ago. The Blackwood family is long dead. Their sanitarium is a scar on the land, but their work, their true work, survives. The true horror of the Blackwood enterprise was not the clinical butchery of Dr. Alistair, nor the grim efficiency of Julian's furnace. It was the simple, terrible idea conceived by Serafina, that human beings could be sorted, classified, and ultimately devalued based on a set of observable data points. That a person's worth could be measured by their visibility. They needed a furnace to erase 137 people. Today, with the click of a button, a person can be erased from digital society, denied credit, denied housing, denied a place in the world, all based on algorithms we cannot see and do not understand. Dr. Thorne erased his research in a fit of terror, but the ghost is out of the machine. The concept has been proven. Serafina's ledger is no longer written with ink. It is coded in silicon. This is where our investigation must end. We are left with the evidence, the legacy, and a final, deeply unsettling question. What is more terrifying, Dr. Blackwood's scalpel or Serafina's algorithm? One murdered the body. The other provides the architecture to erase the soul on a scale the Blackwoods could have only dreamed of. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we have inadvertently built a modern, digital version of the Blackwood system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people and the systems they create hoped would never be told.